All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to our My Cares webinar. We are thrilled to have Dr. Jessica Madrigal from the National Cancer Institute with us today. Dr. Madrigal is a research scholar and environmental epidemiologist, and she's going to talk to us today about childhood cancer and environmental exposures. So go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Jessica Madrigal. As was mentioned, I'm an environmental epidemiologist at the National Cancer Institute and formerly trained from the University of Illinois. So happy to be speaking to a group back in the Midwest. I've been in Maryland for a few years now. But going to be talking to you about pesticide use, indoor residential exposures, and childhood cancer. So really looking forward to the discussion around this. If I could advance the slide. Okay. So just a very, very brief overview about cancer among children. This is, a rather rare condition, cancer in children and adolescents, but it is the leading cause of death by disease after infancy among children in the United States. So the most recent estimates from 2023 that there are approximately 10,000 cases of childhood cancer diagnosed in the U.S., and about 1,000 children die from cancer annually. So although mortality has improved over the last several decades, still a substantial number of children dying from this disease. And cancer in children, unlike cancer in adults that ranges from a lot of different cancer sites, we can identify some of the most common types of cancer among children under age 15. And this commonality of these different types really also influences our ability to study epidemiologically the environmental causes of these cancers. So the most common types of childhood cancer is childhood leukemia. And generally this falls into two histologic types, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or ALL, and acute myeloid leukemia, or AML. We also have brain and other central nervous system tumors that are quite common. And less common are things like lymphomas, soft tissue sarcomas, germ cell tumors, and bone tumors. So when you think about environment, there are a lot of different environmental risk factors that have been evaluated in relation to childhood cancer. So even though the rest of this short talk is going to focus on pesticides, I just wanted to make everyone aware, if you're not already, of just the different variety of topics where if you were to search the literature or do a Google, you would be able to find literature looking at associations between these different environmental risk factors and childhood cancers. So air pollution, whether that's traffic-related air pollution or industrial air pollution, drinking water contaminants. There's a more recent literature on oil and gas development, so things like fracking, as well as conventional oil development. Residential radon exposure has been evaluated. And then here at the NCI in the Occupational Environmental Epi branch, we look at a lot of agricultural exposures in relation to childhood cancer. So that could be ranging from animal exposures, pesticides, which is an area that I specialize in, as well as dust. And dust can take many forms, whether it's pesticides measured in dust, or biologically active dust, and you're thinking about things like glycans and endotoxins, and then also thinking about residential pesticide exposures. So the flip side of agriculture, the products that you're using in and around your home, or that might be inadvertently being sprayed or used around your home as a result of the neighborhood that you live in. So when you think about pesticide and childhood cancer, I just want to give some background on the state of this literature. There are probably over 30 studies of childhood leukemia that have evaluated parental occupational pesticide use. So much of the literature doesn't come from, measuring pesticides in food or measuring pesticides in a urine or a blood sample or in dust, but really comes from self-reported exposures. And a large focus of this work has been on parental occupation. So whether or not the father or the mother were doing any kind of pesticide exposed work. So we have seen in the literature consistent increased risks observed for maternal exposures to pesticides, especially during the pregnancy period. There have been fewer studies of central nervous system and brain tumors, but there is some evidence for increased risk of childhood brain tumors with parents' occupational exposures. And most studies have found stronger associations with exposures among the mothers relative to among the fathers. And the strongest evidence is really for exposures during the pregnancy period compared to early childhood. So most studies have found stronger associations with mother versus father's exposures, with the strongest evidence for exposures during pregnancy compared to early childhood. And generally, when we're designing epi studies of childhood cancer, if it's a really well-designed study and you have the ability to do it, you do want to look at exposures during these two very etiologically relevant periods. The prenatal period, some people even look at the preconception period, as well as early childhood, which is, at least for childhood leukemia, generally birth to age 2 or birth to age 5 or whenever the cancer was diagnosed. But one caveat of these studies is that most of them are case control studies. So oftentimes collecting this information on the childhood cancer cases after they've been diagnosed. So really worried about potential selection biases there, as well as recall biases from the parents or guardians who are generally answering the questions about these exposures, as they're all self-reported. So just, why are children's exposures to pesticides in the home so important? I often say that children are not small adults, but children really can have higher exposure to pesticides than adults for a variety of reasons, including higher respiration rates, the fact that their breathing zone is really closer to the floor, and they spend a considerable amount of time on the floor, which really puts them at risk for ingesting house dust, which could be a substantial route of exposure. They're also exposed in utero to different chemicals, including pesticides that could be passing through the placenta. And for childhood cancers, as I've said, these critical windows of exposure generally are in utero in the very early childhood period. So besides for recent use around the home, lawn and garden, and past use, these are all contributing to pesticides that we find in the home. So pesticides and other chemicals can persist indoors, and they can be found many years or even decades after they were last applied. And this frequently depends on the specific pesticide active ingredient that you're talking about. So sources could be your own household use. Maybe you're spraying for ants, or you're putting down ant traps, you're spraying for ticks. If it's a home that you've moved into or a rental, what was the past use of pesticides by the prior occupant? There could be community spraying, whether that's a neighborhood or a municipality or a homeowners association, as well as agricultural drift and worker take-home exposures. And about 80 to 90% of households use pesticides in some capacity based on self-report from studies that we've previously conducted. And about 2% of the US population lives on farms, 14% live in rural areas with the potential for indirect exposure via drift. And I think that in particular is a gross underestimate of the potential exposure from living residentially proximal to agricultural pesticide uses. So agricultural pesticide use in the US can occur via proximity to agriculture. Approximately 17% of US land is planted in agricultural crops. So this map here, the green shaded area, shows agricultural land as of 2016. And this could potentially result in a substantial portion of the United States residents potentially living within proximity to agriculture. So there have been some prior studies of agricultural pesticide exposures. Many of these in the US are based on the state of California that has a really unique database where they actually track all pesticide use for agricultural purposes since 1990. And prior work that was done here at the NCI was looking at crop maps and pesticide application to really create exposure metrics to capture this for people who weren't involved occupationally in agriculture at all, but just were living within proximity to fields and other agricultural orchards and things like that. And what they found was that agricultural use within 1.25 kilometers of a home was associated with higher concentrations of 5 of 7 pesticides in house dust. So insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, all of those were associated with proximity to the agriculture. But I think there's still a really huge gap. We don't understand truly the relationship between residential proximity and exposure potential due to pesticide drift. And many studies have just used one exposure metric. They haven't looked at wind or meteorologic conditions or thought about the transport of each specific pesticide chemical. So that's work that I've been doing, evaluating agricultural pesticide use within 4 kilometers of a home and how that impacts or doesn't the pesticide levels in carpet dust collected from the homes. And I'm able to do this with the California Childhood Leukemia Study. This is a population-based study in California that had 3 main components. They did interviews and collected a lot of information, but they also collected house dust samples from the vacuum cleaner. And then because we know where the person lives, we're able to link their residential information to the California database of pesticide use. So I'll briefly show you what some of that looks like. So here, and I think you can see my mouse, we know where the participant lives. And in California, we actually know where different herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides were used. So for this hypothetical participant, I know that within 4 kilometers of their home, there were 4 fields, 4 land sections where glyphosate was applied. And I can create metrics based off of that information. We could also use crop information, which is satellite imagery, where we know here's the home and here are these areas of land where pesticides were used. And then here are the row crops and here's the pasture hay. And we could put that into the metric that we use to determine their exposure. We can also use information on wind. So there's very, very granular wind data where we know if a home was downwind of an application site, and we can incorporate that into the metric. And just to give an idea of what this looks like in California, this is probably the southern half of California. The shaded dots, they're actually squares, sorry, really represent the amount of herbicides used in totality during a 6-year period in agricultural applications. And many of these are in residential areas where people do in fact live within 1 to 4 kilometers of each of these land parcels. In particular, in the California Childhood Leukemia Study, for around 600 participants, we find that almost 70% of them live within 4 kilometers of any application of an herbicide. And we find a higher proportion of Hispanic households are exposed to higher amounts compared to non-Hispanic households. This is particularly true for glyphosate. I'm sure all of you have heard of glyphosate or Roundup, the active ingredient. And we find that Hispanic children in particular in California had almost 10 times higher agricultural use compared to non-Hispanic white children as accounted for in this database. We also find these herbicides in the dust in their homes. So glyphosate detected in nearly all of the household dust samples that we looked at, as well as other commonly used herbicides like 2,4-D, cymazine, and trifluralin. And what we found was that median dust concentrations were almost 2 times higher in homes that had agricultural use nearby compared to homes that didn't. So just taking away that in this population-based study, this is not a study of farmers. Approximately 70% of children had agricultural pesticide use within 2 to 4 kilometers of their home. And it was really driven by the high prevalence of glyphosate and chlorpyrifos use. Chlorpyrifos is an insecticide. There were really differences in exposure prevalence by Hispanic ethnicity. And all in all, we found that for 6 of 9 insecticides and 8 of 9 herbicides, agricultural use within 4 kilometers of the home was a really important determinant of indoor contamination. So I just want to close with a study that we're working on. Now that we've really shown what the prevalence of potential exposure to these agricultural pesticides is, we're looking within the California Childhood Leukemia Study to determine if living within 4 kilometers of these different active ingredients is associated with childhood leukemia. So customizing that to the prenatal and early life periods, using residential history, so knowing where these children lived at birth and prior to diagnosis, and able to do this for the 2 most common childhood leukemias, ALL and AML, with a wide range of pesticides and a pretty big distance, being able to account not only for the timing of applications, agricultural land use, but also wind direction. And with that, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen and we could open it up for discussion and questions.
Thanks so much for that presentation. It's certainly eye-opening to think about the impact of outdoor exposures on our indoor environment. I've got a few questions that were submitted ahead of time, but I encourage everyone who's with us live to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll follow that as well. So the first question that we got is one that we're thinking about a lot, and that's, what is our pesticide exposure related to the fruits and vegetables that we buy at the store?
That's a really good question. Our work here in the Occupational Environmental Epi branch really focuses more on either pesticide exposures from being a farmer or living with a farmer, or my work that's more environmental. Do you live close to any kind of agricultural activity? But the potential exposure route through food isn't trivial. There have been a few studies, particularly from the University of Idaho, that have looked at like their diet studies where they've given people, here's a standard diet, take all this food, eat it. We're going to measure the glyphosate in your urine. And here's an organic set of food, make these meals, eat it. We're going to measure it in your urine again. And they've definitely shown that with the organic diet, participants had much lower levels of glyphosate in their urine. But in terms of knowing what exactly is in our food according to, the specific pesticide active ingredients, I think that's really hard to do. And even with, a lot of my work is focused on the pesticides in dust in the home. Even to try to say, what's the lay of the land in terms of biomarkers, so measures of pesticide in your urine or your blood. A lot of the urinary biomarkers of pesticides are really short term. So they're only telling you the pesticide level from like the day or the few days prior, maybe that week. And in terms of being able to say, oh, there could be this many grams of this particular pesticide in that apple, I don't feel like we have really good handle on that data.
Yeah, it's certainly, dietary exposures are extremely hard to capture. All right, so we have some questions in the live chat about, do pesticides cause cancer? And this is always a very difficult question around causation, but it is one that people want to know. And so what level of evidence do you feel like truly exists for specific cancers and specific pesticide exposures?
I mean, I can't agree more that that's a very, very difficult question to answer. I mean, the first complication of it all is that there are so many different pesticides. So, for example, in my work in California, the California Pesticide Use Registry has been basically requiring anyone that applies a pesticide since 1990 to any agricultural commodity to record the active ingredient, the amount used, where they sprayed it, how they sprayed it. And even just going through that list of over 600 different, right? So we say pesticides. Pesticides are a huge umbrella. Pesticides break down into herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, even rodenticides. Don't say that one too often, but the active ingredients to kill vermin. Within each of those, you have different classes of pesticides. And really what we're thinking about when we're thinking about, does this particular pesticide cause cancer, is the active ingredient, for which there are thousands. So, for example, glyphosate, the International Agency for Research on Cancer considers glyphosate a probable human carcinogen, a group 2A agent. But at this point in time, it's 2024. I forget exactly when IARC reviewed glyphosate, but it was sometime in the mid 2010s, maybe 2017. But there's been new evidence since then, but even to say cancer is associated with kidney cancer, or glyphosate is associated with kidney cancer or childhood leukemia, you really have to have a very strong body of evidence from human studies. And those really take a long time. And childhood cancer in particular is so rare. I think that's why when we say, oh, parental pesticide exposures are associated with childhood leukemia, it's based on self-report, because getting objective measures is just very difficult for such a rare disease. So I unfortunately don't have a great answer to that question.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to get down to causation with any given risk factor. However, it's probably a reasonable statement that avoiding exposure to the extent possible is a good idea. And so we have several questions sort of circling around how do we address trying to get less exposure. For example, one person submitted ahead of time, can you lobby your homeowners association to stop spraying? Or if there is spraying, when they tell you it's safe to go back 30 minutes later for you or your pet or your kids and so on, is that true? And then also related, are there steps people can take to with contacting the government to try to decrease exposure?
Yeah, these are all great questions. And I definitely think, when you're thinking about, here I am, I'm living life, I'm existing in the world, there's all these potential ways I could be exposed. You control what you do within your own home, hopefully to a great degree. Maybe that varies among individuals. But you could, if you're in an HOA type setting, maybe one of the conversations at your board meeting is, what are we spraying for? And at what frequency? And what chemicals are we using? And maybe that's a broader conversation of, maybe as a community, we care a little bit less about lawn and garden weeds, and we could maybe spray infrequently or not at all for those. But, we're really worried about ants and we want to control that, or we want to control ticks. So really just trying to get that first bolus of information of what are we spraying for, how frequently, when. And maybe if as a community or as a HOA board, people are thinking, well, we have to spray. Well, can we pick a particular day or the third Saturday of the week so that people know and can be informed on when the spraying will be happening? Or can we do it under conditions that are a little bit more conducive to controlling the drift of these active ingredients? So can you do it right before it rains? Or can we make sure that, everybody knows these spots are being sprayed then and these other spots are being sprayed at a different time? So I think having that information, if you're not in control of the use, can be really informative to your own strategies to try to avoid. I know myself, had many conversations within my household about, treating for ticks, because the dogs go out and they're going to bring it back in, but I also don't want to bring in the ticks in, but then I have a 3-year-old and, it's complicated, but trying, I think, to have as much information as you can and make the conditions as right. You can't control everything, and there's so many things out there, but having as much information as you can, I think, when you're not exactly in control of the potential spraying could be important.
Yeah, and potentially choosing alternatives like vinegar, for example, that maybe there are some safer alternatives to consider. So those are really, really good ideas. All right, so we've had another question about vacuuming and dusting the house. And the question is it better to vacuum less often or or more often, or is there any guidance around that?
Well, if you're so we in the California Childhood Leukemia Study and also in the Agricultural Health Study, a sub-study, we use a lot of vacuum cleaner dust to measure pesticides in household dust. And that dust, whether it's taken with, your Hoover vacuum cleaner that you've got in the linen closet, or the specialized scientific vacuum that we sometimes use, that dust that we're getting out of like the depths of your carpet is really long-lasting dust that has been in the deepness of those fibers for quite some time. So I think it's a little bit different than just thinking, oh, I can touch that shelf and there's a swipe of dust on my finger. We're really thinking about dust as a source of pesticides that may have drifted in, whether on your shoes or through the air or through soil or whatever it may be, that have just been around in that environment and are recirculating for quite some time. We've done some more exposure assessment type work where if we take 2 or 3 dust samples over the course of 5 or 6 years, we're finding similar levels of these pesticides in the dust. We do it mostly to say that these active ingredients within the dust sample are stable. So one sample is good enough for a study of risk. But I think it just shows how persistent some of these chemicals can be. So whether you're cleaning every day or every week, I think it's less so about your own personal cleanliness and more so about the potential sources of exposure outside of your home that are coming in.
Interesting. Okay. So we have another really interesting question about whether the chances of potential pesticide exposure are higher in lower income areas or in older homes.
So I think whether or not pesticide exposures are higher in lower income areas is going to depend on a range of factors. If you live in a lower income area that is more rural and more adjacent to agriculture, then yes, you're going to have potentially more residential proximity exposure from drift. But the same as, high income area that's also adjacent to agriculture is going to have those same potential exposures. I know from our studies in California, home age is definitely a factor that plays into the potential levels of exposure. But again, it really depends on the active ingredient. So some of these pesticides, like organochlorines, which have been banned since before I was born, we still find them in house dust and we still find them in our bodies today because they're just so persistent and they're so slow to break down in the environment. But other pesticides like carbamates or pyrethroids are a little bit less persistent. So in terms of home age, older homes tend to have more of these residues just because of the potential for accumulation over time of different tenants or different occupants using them. And I think too, if you're thinking about the intersection between income and potential exposure, if you're living in a building where you don't control the circumstances of what's going on and the management company wants to spray or have an exterminator out every month, then potentially you are having higher exposures. But on the flip side, you might have a poor management company who doesn't want to spray for anything and you're living with pests. So then it becomes your own decision on how do you handle it. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer for that, unfortunately, or for many of the things that we study.
Yeah. Well, so this segues into another question, which is that there are many companies that offer testing of environmental exposure. Some of them you do yourself and mail in, and sometimes you can also have a company come out. Do you think that has value, or and then the follow-up on this question is about should you base decisions upon those results? And I'll just say from an equity issue is not everyone can address those issues. We don't necessarily have the ability to move or to clean up in a different way. So
That's really interesting. I guess I've thought about all these things where you could swab yourself and send it in terms of, the marketing of my genetic data potentially, but not in terms of exposure. I guess I would just caution anyone on if you do that, what can you make of the information that you get back? I have been studying epidemiology for over a decade and have collected many different samples and run many different analytes through them. And we're extremely cautious about how we interpret those results from a population pool of over 1,000 people. I would never want to draw inference from one sample, like you would get if you were to, swab yourself and mail it in and get it back. And I think particularly with some of these, newer do-it-yourself kind of things, what you get returned to you doesn't necessarily tell you like an actionable level. Like we always say, there's no safe level of lead. Well, what level of glyphosate that you get back from this test tells you that you have quote unquote too much? I don't think these things can really tell you that. And even when we're looking at risk, usually, let's say we measure glyphosate for 1,000 people. Oftentimes, we're gonna break those people up into 5 groups. The groups with the highest level of glyphosate all the way down to the lowest. And even in the highest level, we might see increased risk with whatever the outcome is, but it might be small. And that's with a very large sample of people and doing a lot of, robust looking at of the data. So I guess I worry that these one-off tests that you do yourself could just really cause people mental anguish and worry that's unnecessary because these companies don't do their due diligence or really have the scientific information to tell you how to make behavioral decisions as a result of what they're giving you back.
Yeah, I think that we have to be a little bit weary when we don't know what to do with the information. But we do have another question about whether there are alternatives farmers can use or approaches they can take to make it safer for spraying pesticides when there are homes nearby.
I think there's definitely approaches farmers can use and probably that farmers do use. If you think about farms in, Iowa or North Carolina, a lot of times now farms are more commercialized as time has come more closer to current. Small time farms have really whittled away and big commercial farms are taking off. But most farmers live on the farm. So they're, you have to be licensed to be a pesticide applicator. You have to go through, some rigorous training to be quote unquote allowed to use these active ingredients. So I think thinking of farmers as maliciously not using the right techniques or anything like that isn't the way to think about it because, they need to protect themselves as well. So things like spraying, on a non-windy day, that's something that I think is always taken into consideration. There are differences in whether or not you're, wearing a backpack sprayer and you're walking around and spot spraying versus if you're doing aerial spraying. And there are a lot of protocols that farmers use. Truly probably not only for health protection, but for economical purposes. If you're purchasing pesticides, you want them to go in the intended area onto your crop and not elsewhere. Otherwise, you have to spend more money on more pesticides. So I think there are things that they do follow in terms of meteorologic conditions, just general practices on how they apply and things like that.
Yeah, super interesting. So this is a question that comes up quite a bit, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, but can you just tell us whether organic farming practices are really meaningfully different than non-organic practices?
Well, they are different. I think though the thing that maybe people don't really recognize or reflect on, if you have one plot of land and you have an organic farm, and then 2 kilometers down the road you have a non-organic farm, I think the worry for the organic farmer is that there could be drift from that non-organic farm that comes over inadvertently to their organic farm. So I think there is quite a conversation going on, not necessarily here, but just in agriculture in general, of if I'm investing all of these resources to do organic farming, I don't want my neighbor's farm to inadvertently be contaminating it. But I think to even, eating completely organic is hard. It's expensive. And there are things that people can do with non-organic foods, like, properly washing and peeling and choosing to buy organic berries versus organic bananas, because berries are one of the most heavily pesticide-laden foods. Different things where if you can't go organic, you can try to be a little bit more judicious about what you're buying and what type, whether it's organic or not.
I hadn't thought about being choosy in that way, and so I think it would be very interesting to put together an infographic around kind of strategic use of organic fruits and vegetables based on exposure and cost. And
the environmental working group, they put out their dirty dozen every few months, where they've looked at all of the fruits and vegetables, whether it's organic or not, and they kind of rank, here are the top 12 foods that if you can, try to buy them organically. I think about this every single time I buy a strawberry. And then they also, on the flip side, they say these are probably the 12 safest foods to buy non-organically, because of, just the way the farming process operates and when spraying would occur, or that they're inside a peel. So they're more protected from the pesticide actually getting into the part that you eat.
Yeah. Wow. That's super good to know. And we'll work with you to get those lists and get that out to all of our participants on the webinar, and then also our MyCares participants as well. All right, we have a few minutes left. We've had a question or two about dose. So I guess the question is are there data on both dose, but also frequency and duration?
In terms of eating or in terms of cancer risk?
I think in terms of cancer risk.
So definitely in any study that we're doing, we're always looking for these, cardinal signs of carcinogenicity. So is there an exposure response pattern? So like I was saying with my example of glyphosate, if I take 1,000 people's urinary glyphosate level and I take the top 20%, do I see a gradient of risk with people with the highest levels having the highest risk? And it really, trends downward of almost no risk for people who are quote unquote non-exposed or have the lowest levels. So we're always looking for that characteristic to truly get at being able to say anything about potential causality.
Yeah, so just for all of the non-epidemiologists on the call, dose response is one of the pillars of establishing causality, because in general, we would expect that the more you're exposed, the more at risk you are, though sometimes there is a threshold of, above which we don't see any additional increased risk, for example. And so keeping in mind, of course, that you're a cancer epidemiologist, we do have a question on whether pesticide exposure is associated with other childhood health outcomes, such as neurodivergence.
So cancer is an incredibly difficult outcome to study. You have to have a long latency period, usually less so for childhood cancer, but establishing causality for cancer is difficult. There have been a lot of studies looking at pesticides in relation to both adult and childhood neurological disorders. So the California pesticide use database that I mentioned that I use in my work, there's a whole literature out of the state of California that has looked at pesticides and Parkinson's disease, pesticides and intelligence quotient in adolescents, pesticides and autism, and other neurological disorders. I can actually send you a link to a couple of papers if that would be helpful for whoever answered or asked the question. I mean, none of these are papers that are saying, "Oh my gosh, this is two days of being exposed to this particular pesticide is absolutely causing this particular outcome." But it's definitely something that I think people are looking into and trying to disentangle.
Okay, I'm just going to take a quick look through here and see. All of the questions. So this is another interesting one. And I like this question too, because we're always looking for things that can be done to mitigate exposures at no cost. So one of our attendees asked whether taking your shoes off at the door when you enter your house will lead to less exposure.
So we've actually looked at this so the pesticide dust work that I presented on, I think it was 9 insecticides, 8 herbicides, 2 fungicides. We were able to look and see if taking your shoes off actually predicted the dust concentrations in the home. It was only associated in a multivariable model. So in a very, had a lot of factors going on that we were accounting for in there. It was associated with lower levels of a few of the pesticides. I wouldn't take these models that I ran as like the biblical what you should do about taking your shoes off. But I think taking your shoes off before you get in your house or leaving them at your front door and not walking through your house with them on is something that really shouldn't cause you any harm. It takes you an extra few minutes, and even if we can't show it with exposure data that we have, I definitely think what we know about the residues, not only of pesticides, but of other gross things that are on your footwear, is definitely something that everybody could do to try to limit their exposure to pesticides, pathogens, and the like. I have a very firm rule of take your shoes off before you walk through my house.
Yeah, I like that as an easy action. I'm always looking for easy actions.
And I think too, I think a lot of times people don't think of, here I am at work. Is there anything I bring home from work? I work in this office. I'm probably not bringing anything home. But if you have anyone that's working in any kind of lawn and garden or pesticide exposed occupation, not only taking off their shoes before they get home, but changing their clothes, changing out of work clothes, either, when they're about to leave the workplace or maybe in the garage or as soon as they get home, and putting those separate from the other laundry. When I was in Chicago, we worked with people who worked at the Ford auto plant, and that was a huge thing. Everybody made sure that they took their clothes off and they changed out of their work clothes if they were working in the plant in a non-administrative role. I think the same thing goes for pesticides. If you could even have like a doormat at your front door and, wipe your shoes before you get into the home over the threshold, that could really limit the pesticide levels that you're bringing in.
Super helpful. All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this. Of course, the MyCare study is collecting data on 18 to 49-year-olds about these kinds of exposures, and ultimately we will look to see whether there are associations with cancer. And so your work really complements what we're trying to do here in Michigan. So we very much appreciate you taking your time today. And
happy to chat with you.
That was great. And we'll post this on the MyCare's website in case anyone wants to go back and rewatch any part of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your afternoon.